Well, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to get back into the little Suzuki TS50 restoration project. And we're going to be talking about the speedometer specifically. And I'm going to take you through a few steps that I'm going to go through to recondition the speedometer. I'm not going to restore it. In other words, I'm not going to take it all apart and clean the internals and go through that level of detail. Number one, I don't think it needs it. And number two, working with speedometers is a little bit tricky. You know, parts aren't available, and many of them are not really made to be disassembled, particularly from this vintage. Suzuki speedometers are predominantly plastic, and you can get yourself into hot water really quick with these if you're not careful. And since it's in reasonably good condition, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. I'm going to recondition it, clean it up, and do a few minor things to it before we put it back on the bike. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to come back over here to the bench behind me. I'll set up an overhead. Parts we're talking about today doesn't look like a lot of pieces because, well, frankly, it isn't. Speedometer, mounting bracket, and attaching hardware. Let's talk about the speedometer first. Simple little unit. It does not have an odometer, you may notice. Consequently, it doesn't have the trip knob. It's showing 2,148 miles, and I have no reason to believe that's not original given the condition of the bike and the fact that the speedometer worked when I got it. Basically all plastic construction, very good condition actually for these plastic speedometers. Suzuki plastic speedometers of this vintage, especially on a bike like this that's used by kids, teenagers, generally don't survive very well, but this one looks quite good actually. So that's why I'm not really going to do a major overhaul. I'll pull the 4 lights out, the bulbs, make sure they're working. I will clean the back up really good. I'll clean the overall exterior of the unit, polish the face here a bit, and I will be re-sleeving the plastic PVC sleeve that's cracked. It's always one of my standards that I do. You've seen me re-sleeve looms before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time probably demonstrating how to do that. Got a number of videos detailing that kind of procedure. So that'll be it for the speedometer. The bracket right here, you'll notice it's a flat black or a matte finish. It is not high gloss like a lot of the components on this bike are. I will strip it in my media cabinet. I'll soak it in evaporust for overnight or 24 hours. There is some surface rust down in this bend here. I don't know if you can see that very well or not. Right here, and I want to make sure I get all the rust out of the crevices that I can't get with media. Then I'll powder coat it with a flat or a matte finish black. I have to get my powder coating set up out anyway. My buddy Jim is coming over in a couple of days. He has a couple of parts that he needs powder coated, so I'll just do this at the same time. His parts will be high gloss, so we'll have to change over the powder, but that's like a 5-minute change. That'll be repowder coated. And let's talk about the attaching hardware a little bit. This is the hardware, by the way, that holds this bracket onto the speedometer, and it goes, something like this. You'll notice there's 2 grommets, one here, which I have every reason to believe are original. The bracket fits something like that, and then one of these flat washers, and then there's supposed to be a lock washer which is missing on both stems. So that leads me to believe that someone has had this apart before. Well, not only because the lock washers are missing, but the dampers that we'll talk about here in just a minute for attaching here are not, one of them's not original. So the lock washers are missing, and then of course you just have a nut that's a little tiny nut like that spins on and holds the assembly together. So I'm going to have to address the hardware one way or the other, either replate these pieces and come up with new additional or different lock washers, rather I should say, and then I've got to do something about the grommets themselves. The grommets right here, these 2 grommets, this one in my right hand is not original. You can tell by looking at it. This one I believe is, and I think the way these are supposed to go is pressed through. There's a shoulder right here that's supposed to go through this hole and then protrude slightly on the opposite side, or something similar to that. I have to go back and look at how it's mounted on the bike. It either does that or it does this, but it probably does this. But nonetheless, these grommets need to be addressed. This one is deteriorated to the point that's not usable. So these are no longer available from Suzuki, I believe, if I recall, looking up the parts. You can get them on eBay, but of course they want a fortune for them. They want like $8 or $10 each for these on eBay, and of course this is not the original. So here's my plan for the hardware. In terms of the flat washers, that would be these. I went through all my parts and I found two of them. I happen to have exactly two. They're Honda parts right there. They're exactly the same washer. All dimensions. In fact, I had one out of the bag. I'd cut it open to measure it, and it's exactly the same. Now remember, these manufacturers back in the day, in fact, still today, I'm sure, they don't make all their individual parts themselves. They source these from suppliers, and it's very likely, in fact, I'd almost bet on it, that the Honda parts are probably made by the same company, sourced from the same people that made the Suzuki parts. It's probably virtually the same part, just put in a Honda bag with a different part number. But those match, so I'm going to use those as replacements for the flat washers so I don't have to replate these. I could, but I'm not going to bother. I've got these extras, Hondas anyway. In terms of the nuts, that would be these little nuts right here. I also have those in my inventory. These are actually Suzuki parts. They're the same part number right here that Suzuki calls out on their parts diagrams. I've got 3 of those, so I've got the new nuts, so I'm not going to bother plating these either because I don't need to. And I have one of the lock washers, excuse me, one right there. That's a Suzuki part. That is the one called out on the parts diagrams. And I went through my used parts hardware inventory and I found a little same identical lock washer that's in very good condition that I'll use as the second of the two to replace the missing two when I took the part or the unit apart. In terms of these grommets right here, again, I went through all my parts, and what I found was I have 4 Kawasaki parts right there. It's a part number. I think these are used for fender mounting on one of the Kawasaki models. Without looking it up, I'm not sure which one. Probably multiple models. Anyway, this damper is, I think Kawasaki calls it a damper, is virtually identical to the Suzuki as far as I can tell. Right here, it's a just slightly smaller in overall diameter. That would be this dimension right here. Close enough for my purposes, and it does have a shoulder like the Suzuki original ones had. This shoulder might be a little bit too deep or too long. I don't know. When I go to put it together, I'll figure that out. And if I need to reduce this dimension here of the damper, I will do so, but I have 4 of these to replace this one right here and certainly that one, which is not original. So that's my plan for the dampers. I don't know if I mentioned it, but I don't think these are available from Suzuki any longer, if I recall. Again, that's my plan going forward with the parts and the projects. Whether I'm going to show every step of it, I don't know. I might show bits and pieces of it. The major focus now is going to be stripping this bracket and preparing it for powder coating, and then once I've got that done, then it's just a matter of cleaning everything up, fitting it back together, and putting it on. 10 minutes later, and I thought I'd give you a little view of the bracket after I completed removing the finish in the media cabinet. Again, I predominantly use glass beads for something like this rather than something more aggressive. I do have other media, but glass beads is kind of my go-to, and it's what I keep in the cabinet almost all the time. Now, some folks would probably think, well, why are you going to bother putting this in Evaporust? It looks pretty good to me. Well, number one, I've got the time. I've got the Evaporust. I won't be powder coating it for a couple of days. I don't want any flash rust. So there's no reason not to put it in Evaporust and make sure I don't have any rust left in any crevices that I can't really see, especially down in here, around these edges, that kind of kind of situation. So it'll go into the tank in a little container, evaporate for 24 hours or so at least. Then I'll take it out of there, clean it up, put it back in the cabinet, blast it one more time just to clean it up and make the substrate of the material uniform and finish, give it a little bite, wash it in clean acetone, and then it'll be do a test of the speedometer, just about done, ready to go back on the bike, just to make sure it works. Now it did work when I took it off, but I thought, well, I'll go ahead and test it again just to make sure. I've got the original drive cable hooked up to it, and on the other end I just have a drill, as you can see there, and I'm going to run it up to speed and see what happens. I think you can see that. It's a little bit lazy coming back to 0, as you can see there probably. But I'm not going to worry about it. I'm satisfied. I'll show you the finished speedometer just before I put it back on the bike. You can see I've re-sleeved the wiring here. Here's the original sleeving that came off it. Typically it's hard and brittle. I had to cut it off. So I replaced that with new sleeve from my inventory. Cleaned up the loom. I did have to replace one of the light bulbs. The neutral light was burned out, so I just replaced that from my inventory because I keep those bulbs around. A little point I'd like to make is when you pull these rubber plugs out that hold the bulbs in, be real careful. In fact, I don't remove them unless I absolutely have to, because because they're old and brittle, they'll split and rip on you when you try to pull them out. And I use dielectric grease to lubricate them when I put them back in. So the only one of the 4, and there are 4, that I removed was the neutral light because I had to replace that when the other 3 bulbs all tested okay. I did not turn the mileage back. As you can see, it's still at 2148. If I'd opened this up and restored it, I probably would have turned it back to 0, but I'm not going to bother. I'm going to just leave it the way it is. Bracket's been powder coated matte finish black to match the original or reproduce the original look. It's been reassembled with new hardware, as I talked about before, and new grommets here. Those are I think those are the Kawasaki grommets, if I recall. And the next step for this unit will be to install it back on the bike. Now, I'm not going to take you through the reassembly or attaching this back to the bike. That's pretty academic, but I will bring you back later once it's mounted on the bike, and we'll do a quick review of what it looks like installed back on the As you can see, I have the reconditioned speedometer installed on the bike, and as part of this work, I also completed the installation of a new speedometer drive cable. That was an NOS cable, by the way, as well as the front brake cable right there. So all the cabling is done now. I don't have it all completely routed correctly yet. So we have the throttle over here, of course, the switch wiring, you can see, I think right there. Brake cable we just talked about. And then we have the switch over here, the starter. Some people might call that a choke. It's really an enrichener. And then, of course, the clutch right there. And everything is working. So the clutch works, the brake works, throttle works, speedometer works, cable's all installed. Front brake works fine. Once I mounted the cable here, I ran it down to the front wheel, and it seems to be working correctly as well. So quite pleased with the way everything came out. And next steps for this project was to move on, I suppose, to the body work. I've got quite a bit of work to do on the body work to repair it before I send it off to have the final painting done. You will notice, by the way, that I have not completed bundling on the wiring right here. the wiring, the final routing and bundling of the wiring and connections, as well as bundling of the control cables and such, will be one of the very last things I do. I prefer to do that at the very end of the process, because what I have found is in the process of installing bodywork and adding the last bits and pieces, that if I complete the wiring and think I have it done, I usually don't, and I have to reroute it or do something different with the cable ties, so I leave it loose as part of pre-assembly, and then later on when I complete the installation of the bodywork and start tying up the loose ends, at that point then I will finish up with the routing of the cables and the wiring. That's going to be it for this video today, folks. Any issues, questions, thoughts, drop me a note. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching.